Today's draw along lecture in the series of Western civilization major movement periods. We're in the Renaissance here and are following the medieval area in architectural history with the Tempietto. Renaissance is the Latin root is a rebirth, and it's a rebirth of the classical language. It's rediscovered in Florentine Italy and brought back to life by a series of master architects in the Renaissance period, which grows into the Baroque and Rococo later on, and then massive change happens in the next sort of scenographic version of history with neoclassicism and the Industrial Revolution. So find your piece or simply screen capture this once I clear the image here. For the Tempietto, Tempietto is a commemorative tomb designed by Donato Bramante, possibly as early as 1502 in the courtyard of San Pietro in Montorio. So what we're going to work on here is one of the pure architectural gems of classical history, but now we're in the Renaissance of that, the rebirth of that. So looking back at the antiquities of the Greeks and the Romans, now rediscovered in central Italy. So one of our key aspects is going to see that the Tempietto here on the right, and its pure rotunda, as we move around here and find its perfection within the circle and the half dome up above, is actually based off of several different schemes of also rotundas from the ancient antiquities, this being the Temple of Vesta from the Roman era. So it's not as if the building type is an invention, it's just that it's honing down the skill sets of the classical language now in the Tempietto in 1502. So if you need to screen capture, there it is. Grid 11 by 17, we're working with markers again on our way from 20% to 90% to get our full value range across our screen for the section of this morning's lecture. So it is axial perfect, so we can go right down the center of our paper here between our tick marks and find that center point or the front door, the steps coming down. And so it's actually going to be twinned out on both sides. So whatever we do on the left, we'll do on the right. And our key aspect now is once we find our horizon line here, about a fourth or a fifth, as we have the page, we're going to find this to be unusually small in terms of the scale of buildings that you epically see in architectural history that dominate the text. This is very, very modest. So if we go to the front portal here, you can see the scale of the front door inside, and that is the height of an individual figure. So if we did that for us now, somebody walking up here from the base, up a series of steps to the plateau of where things kind of spring from for us, an individual is probably this scale relative to the architecture, which is really diminutive. So the probably most important piece of Renaissance / Baroque architecture is St. Peter's in Rome by a series of architects, including Bramante again, who sketched out the first ideas for the planning for that, is that this would probably fit within one small pier that holds the dome of St. Peter's. And yet it still is sort of an epic piece of architectural history due to its purity. Purity, the theories and circles of proportions and perfect spaces that were believed to be intrinsically connected to the proportions of man. So we'll use the model as a reference over here. The view here is the same no matter where you are within the courtyard of the church's aspect off to the side of it. It was commissioned by Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. They were fervent Catholics in the Spanish realm. They also, I believe, gave funds for Columbus to travel to India, and he found North America instead. But when they commissioned Bramante, they created this high Renaissance piece of Italian architecture. So the Renaissance starts around the 1450s. This is now 1502, 1506. So it's reaching to its point where it's coming to a conclusion of the ideas, the realm of perfection. So the two we'll draw within this are really small gestures in terms of size of buildings, but they're really dominant in terms of the language. So what we're going to do first is, now we've decided on that horizon line. That's kind of the break point then between all these arcs that make their way around here. And we know that the ones that are at the bottom, at the base of us here, are arcing around and they're opening up towards the horizon line as they come around the base here. So really lightly we'll put in a series of steps to take us up. And as they mount up towards this, we'll find that the line gets a bit flatter and flatter until finally the stair meets that level where you're actually on the grade of the temple itself. And that's where it flattens out to the horizon. So kind of a unique view when you walk into the courtyard, your eye is at the base of the start of the building. So it's stairs kind of lifted up from the grade up to that point. And then our next big rotunda is after the columns project out, and you see tick marks for those who make a way around that. We'll have another arc that will come up and be the base of the entablature that'll spin from both sides. And that's more bow than this because this one is closer to the horizon line. So that actually is a circle here, but it flattens out at our eye height. And then the top of the horizon entablature bows even more. So we'll arc that around on both sides. And on top of that is a little balustrade. So we got the little tick mark to start to there on those two corners, and that's the top of that rail detail up there. And now we have the connection between sort of the drum of the dome. That's the cylinder that rises up that supports the efforts of this being the span across the space to take the architecture of structural, the physics behind it, and bring it around the dome and then down the drum itself and into the column load. So here we have the underside. You can see each arc is becoming more and more bent and bowed, and we can really see that little fish hook and that turnaround here. And then finally, the lip of the base of the dome proper. And now, because this is a perfectly hemispherical dome, we've talked about in the past about how domes are shaped more vertically, sometimes a little more squat, and this one happens to be a pure hemisphere. You can really, in perspective, even though we won't see the full circle, we'll draw it in here with our 20%. But if you just simply did a pure circle here now, you'd have that arc of that dome properly drawn out. So we'll show the top third of that now and how it arcs back down. But then the ball is sort of the sacred part as being the universal symbol being lifted off of the face of the earth, and the heroic point because this is believed to be the place where Peter was to be martyred. So it represents one of the only executed plans for a circular church that's this pure in the Renaissance. The interior is tiny, but it's very luminous from the windows up above and the side windows down below. And then the crypt, where you actually find the sacred point of the martyrdom of St. Peter, is down a flight. So those are our key aspects here. These are going to move around on both sides and capture those columns. And now if we drop those down, we'll start with the two in the front, closest to us. And there'll be a little bit, because we're fairly close to this, once you breach the courtyard, and we'll draw sort of the arch for that, the two side walls, and see our 1-point perspective in a second. But we're so close to it that the columns that are right in front of us are almost purely vertical. But as we move out, we're going to cant a little bit to the left as we move the idea of a third point way off the page to the top, maybe a foot or two above us. We think of a third vanishing point right on this line, that this will bend the verticals of the next column closest to us, and then the one after that. And then we finally see another one on the edge there as it wraps around. So we'll come on this side and show that column. And the next one adjacent to it, and the one that wraps around there. So that kind of fills it up, as we'll see in in the plan type, as these columns wrap around, they're all obviously evenly spaced, and on the cardinal axis, X and Y, you'll see portals, the front here, another one on the back, and then windows on the diagonal, crossing that reference here. And we'll diagram that language in elevation a little bit here. As we move up to match the squarish opening down below, we have the threshold of light coming in, an access point to the arcade up above, and then some sculptural apses here, moving between the hemispherical and the rectangular, and the spherical on this side. And now there's a pattern of, you draw the underside of the balustrade, there's a pattern of the actual balusters themselves, which is fairly detailed, and we don't want to make them too much of a primary subject in the time we have. So we simply want to build in some type of system where we're going to start thin, bow out, and return thin, and reverse that profile on this side. And we'll simply repeat that over and over again. So there's a little bulge in the center, then it retreats back, and it makes its way around the skin here, the baluster. And then pretty soon they get so close that they enclose on each other with the spacing the same, and that bends around. So the detail will be more on the front several that we see here. And then again, the lines kind of compress on each other as you wrap around. And so that'll get a sense of that spinning around. This spins around. We'll do a little bit of the typical entablature detail here, where on top of each column, there are the same type of classical order details we've seen in other buildings to date. They march around and learn from the ancients. And now to give it sort of its place and its context inside this courtyard, the two sort of giveaway angles here now are the one side of the court, and then the other side over here will then vanish back to the head of this person, because they're coming down to our horizon line. This person has stepped up above it, but it'll point to that key aspect of where we see this space when we're on grade before we mount the steps ourselves and end up being the height of this person. So for this person, the horizon line moved up to this point. From our view, it's back down here on grade. So those two lines will show us that point again. And then we've got the actual arcade that we walk through that circumvents the entire rotunda here. And so we come through the portal of a large pier in the foreground. And we'll use this as secondary information to kind of complete the sketch and frame it. So this will come back. So we'll see a little bit on the side of this pier, a little bit of the side of this pier, and then the full throw of that pier coming down. And again, you can see those vertical lines converging on that point above the page. And we see a little bit of the underside of this arch on both sides. So we'll probably leave the sky white, we'll tone out the dome, and then we'll use some dark up here to make sure that we get the idea that we're passing through an arcade to be entered into this cloister. And inside that cloister there's this charming Tempietto dedicated to St. Peter, first Bishop of Rome. So scale-wise, on either side, this is a three-story space, so we can drop in a little bit of the side windows we'd see on both sides here. And then there is a lower level of arches on this part of the courtyard, and a little different skin and detail. It's not twinned on both sides because the sections of the parish here were built at different times. And that's secondary detail to us. And then this will repeat itself on this other side. We won't worry too much about that for now. Okay, so that lays it out with our 20%. Now that line will disappear over time here as we move through this. If we look really quickly over here on the right and kind of study the relationship here of how geometry drove the language of the classics and how they're then reinvigorated in the Renaissance. If you try to look at that dome that would sit down and touch sort of like a baseline of the earth here, and then you repeat that above it, and then split that, and then have the entablature and the breadth of the church supporting that. Again, you can see the top of the dome in a sense is triangulated out, and so the columns themselves are working as dead weight to hold that base there. And then we step up to that to get to that holy sacred part of the language of the building, the interior. And so that language then also kind of mimics itself in that from the top of the first circle here, you can have a triangular piece, and if you invert it on itself, it goes to the top of the dome here too. So then you've got the three primary Platonic volumes of circle, square, and triangle all working in harmony there and driving the language of how the purity of this is held by the gift of the geometry of graphics. So we'll move now to 3 and start to look at some of the key shading elements and how we want to articulate that. So we simply have to pick for our point of reference here as we look up to it from about this viewpoint. Kind of fits in there well in terms of the scale of this model. And so we'll simply assume that light's going to come from one side of the courtyard and light this side stronger, like in the photograph here, than the other side. So if that's the case, we'll start with, from top down, we'll say that the cupola up top will have a darker aspect on this side of it. So as it wraps around with detail here and spins around, this side has more strength. And so we'll do the same with the dome. And now we'll use our drafting technique or sketching technique to articulate that. It's got its sort of sectionalized pieces of material up here that show, in a sense, ribbing for the structure of the skin of the dome. And we know that these two panels over here will be darker because they're not receiving any light at all, but you just can't stop linearly. Again, we're going to come back to the idea that when the light hits, it hits a really straight ball of information, which is pure white. And even on the sun side, it gets a little bit lighter, and then over here on the shade side. So we'll leave that. So when the sun comes down, it hits a point, and from that point, it becomes darker and darker away from it. So that hot spot will stay, and will push more value towards this edge and that edge as we move from 30 to 90. This is now a plane that's beneath the dome itself, so it has a little bit of shadow line. So coming across this whole aspect, it'll catch a little bit of light on this side and then go dark as it supports the dome underneath. There's a placeholder. And now this is a cylinder, which has got more depth. So this one is a bit of the underside as well as some of the detail. But now this is going to have sort of an elliptical movement that it catches light directly on the skin of it and then rotates back so that this whole section now will be darker as it moves away. You could probably even bend that down a little bit more as it goes around there. And that helps that rotunda move as we did up here to get the ball see three-dimensional. Now you want the rotunda to do that too. Now, if you look at the photograph, this is nice because you can see the light come in and be light behind the balusters. And now some of the balusters over here are going to be the same tone we want them to read. So we're gonna vary the way we deal the balusters here. So for instance, on this side, we can come back to ones that are in front of a white lit area and assign a dark value to them. Then so when they come over here and it's going to be darker behind them, we're going to leave them white, and eventually we'll do value between the balusters and leave the exact same architecture now, the negative of this. So that had a positive value to it. This will have zero value to it because it'll have a dark background behind it. So you're treating the same thing, is all the same material, the same color, the same stone, but you're drawing it differently to get the language of movement of space. So these are then darker. And now I come to a point where the background, there's no more building behind it. So now the background goes darker and the balusters are lit up. So as we come to this point, we'll darken up the space between the balusters. And then they pick up light on this end. So now the balusters become brighter. The underside of the whole piece is darker here, receiving no light on its shade side. And the whole sort of hand bar up here is brighter. On this side, it becomes completely dark because it's receiving no light. And then wraps around and picks up light on this side. So we're trying to animate the same idea of stone going from light to dark to light to dark and move it around. So it's got, again, that kind of cylindrical effect. Okay, so when the light comes in, it shines down this path, but it'll be shade on the elevation that we saved over here on this side. So there are elements coming down to our horizon line at various levels. And so this is an important relationship of the Tempietto against its backdrop. So we can simply assign this value for now that this whole zone back in here is in shade, showing those banded arcades layer with a darker tone. And that'll help allow the light coming down on that shaft to light apart the left side of these columns, which then allows the right side to go dark. And those columns, and it wraps around then towards our front here. And we'll pick these out too against their backdrop because the next skin inside is even darker than the columns themselves. So even though it's a 3 now, it'll become bolder as we articulate the columns wrapping around. So the columns all have their column capital points at here, and we'll detail that in a little bit. And all the treads are being lit up here very well. So just beneath the tread's lip is a little bit of cast shadow of the bull nose sort of running beyond it. And it comes on this side, it's losing its access to light. So at this point, we draw the value for the treads that are making their way down. Another edge. As it wraps around there. Now this is all well lit on this side. We could take dark up to this corner, but now the sun is lighting this entire elevation over here. So now we'll simply go dark where the fenestration is on this side. And it's sort of, it's an arcade, but it's a blind arcade. It's just decorative on the wall. So it's got punctured windows inside of that. And then we'll come to the underside of this arch, which is very dark, not receiving any light. So eventually that'll have a lot of value for us. We'll just assign line work for now with the number 3. So it's got this a lovely harmonious building technique from all the bearing masonry. The composite order here is a Tuscan order, which is a form of the Doric order. So it's a simple capital top that supports the tablature above it. And it's a precursor to Bramante's rebuilding of St. Peter's. So when he got the commission for that, and it took so many years to do that through multiple popes, that he only had the starting plan, and eventually Michelangelo is giving more of the actual credit for the final church there. And yet Carlo Maderno came after him and did the whole nave. And so it was built in so many phases over so long of a time. It's a mixed bag of architects that designed that, where this is Bramante's entire control here. So we need to have this edge be strong eventually, and want to have the base for these columns in the foreground. So they'll give us that set. And we'll go dark, and we'll push some value over here to really make the sky and the light hit this come out over time. Now up in the entablature, it also is just like this rotunda. It's a cylinder of stone, and so it receives a little bit of light from this side, but it is sitting under the sort of cornice of the lower part of the building. So it's got a deep shadow there. And we got our bishops at the end. So the top is projecting that, and as it moves around, it's going to receive less light over here. So that'll cut back fairly quickly. And we'll have, if we hold out our details for the dentals there, and move across that skin. And then we have tops of all the capitals in this Tuscan order moving around the space. Now we could keep the door in here now, and we'll do a figurine later. That was just to show the earlier scale. So there's our placeholder for the deep wooden door, which is stained up on one of the most dark areas in here. The door's not open, but it'll still be very dark aspect. And then adjacent to it, we've got a window on either side that we'll see a bit of. And then we'll hold on to 1, 2, 3, 4 on this side, 1, 2, 3, 4 on that side. And then right when we get to the return of this, because we want to come around here, and now all of a sudden this will come back in, and we'll see the underside of that roof line become apparent here. So if we could, we'd pass it right through the building, but we can't see that because of the architecture. But here's where the interior ends. So we will see that bit of depth of darkness between the columns here, and then a piece over here as well. That'll help have this idea of this whole entablature that wraps around the building, supported by the array of columns which circumnavigate the exterior. Okay, so we might as well put in then the value for this arch up top, which is working against the light. We can simply just fill that out right to the top of the sketch, and then bring it back down on this side. And a very dark tone here. Coming all the way down. And the same on this side. And don't worry about the scratch just now. We'll come back with higher value markers and clean that up a little bit. So this point obviously is the dominant 1 point. So if we were to move off center, it would change the array of our viewpoint here. If it goes off the page to the left, that's where you see this one would trail out. So because it's bending, we've got the dominant 1 point in the middle. We're also in the middle of a 2-point perspective just for these columns, and yet we're using the 3rd point here up top for some of the verticals to vanish to. So these are recessed volumetric apses up here, so they kind of have a movement of shape as you wrap those around and drop them down. You'll see a little bit behind our opening here, the balusters. And these are shallow, but they're rectangular. So they've got a little movement. And they come right to the edge. You see a little lip of the repetition of that wrapping around it on that side. And then some more of the detail up here for now. Okay, so now we start going up the ladder from 4 to 9 and spend the most time with 4, the least time with 9 as we kind of get more and more settled into our values. So we see the underside of the entablature between the columns, which is a darker aspect here, with a 4 to give us that three-dimensional plate now, because there's a thickness to the entablature as it wraps around. Let it spin a little bit. And then as this elevation goes up, it's got columns attached. When they're attached to the wall, they're called pilasters. And so at this height, then, there are elements of the classical detailing that sort of embark from the base and then rise up the same height as these and then end up at this point above. So we'll see one of those here, and one on this side. And then we'll see framing from that window on this side, the framing from the window there. It's a little darker at the top. And then right at the base, there's a bit of a half wall that moves around the whole rotunda of the horizon line. So we'll see a little bit there, a little bit there. That'll have somewhat of a cast shed on that side. And now we'll strengthen the position of the columns, knowing that they're in the round. Right now, they're kind of drawn like a pie. That's just two-dimensional. So if we use the language of being round, it'll receive the least amount of light beneath the actual column capital, which casts a shadow on it. So that comes down and then has an ellipse and kind of dies to the right side. So by shaping it like that and bringing that down, we kind of made that seem like it's a bit more of a round shape rather than just a flat stonework. So we'll do that for all of them. Bring that down. That down. And kind of keep working all the way around the little Tempietto. And what's remarkable about this is that even though it's a spectacle and every textbook is going to notate Bramante's sort of classical essay here, it's probably one of the least touristed places in Rome. So if you go there in the height of tourist trade in the summer and you make your way in a little architectural pilgrimage to this site, you'll probably be alone in the courtyard when you get there any time of the year. It's kind of off the radar of normal tourism trekking. Spin that around. And now a nice dark is the underside of that whole space in there. Go ahead again. And then probably because there's a wall that circumvents that whole thing. So it's that skin on the inside that supports the same skin up above, and then the drum springs from there. Just like the light from the dot camera here is casting a shadow onto that. The sun's coming down and bouncing light up, but it's receiving the underside here the least. So if you take the top there with your 40 and simply drop it down like that, you can kind of gradate that out. At the same time, you're making it a little bit darker where the least amount of light is as that rotates around. You see a little bit over there. And so that could probably show up with some of the lights on the base wall down here being bounced, but as you come on this side, there's less and less available. So we'll make that darker at this point. But holding on to a little bit of white here, so you have white against the gray, and then we'll darken this up later, so that'll become brighter and whiter. So we want to make sure there's a presence, that the columns don't seem like they're part of the architecture and engage, that they're freestanding and float around. So So we can come back in to some of the demarcation points along the secondary architecture, the courtyard buildings, and drop in a little bit of value there. You know, maybe edge that a little bit. And now come back into our central secondary window and make sure we're going to split it along the pilaster here. Show it working around that. The underside of the pilaster. Side there, wrap those around. Again, pressure points when you start and then drop it around, because the amount of value you see turning the corner there collapses that into a deeper value of the ones that is closest to you. On the side of the built up roofing here, the ribs, you see a little bit of a line work on the shade side. And up to the top. Again, not drawing as much as the 3 and 4 did here. Maybe we'll come back to the detail of the triglyph. Typical Doric order here, Tuscan order. That bends around. And now we'll come back to hold all this, growing girth and weight by coming to the treads. And again, they're not receiving as much light on the far side here, so that'll trail over. So now the face of each riser is shown to us in shade. We want a little bit of white to show the tread coming down. Maybe they'll start over here as well to connect to it. And then right at the base of that front face where it hits the grade, we're going to let those stairs be a little more of a spectacle here by now taking our base, the whole floor plane, what's happening around the tread, and starting with this side with the 40, just simply wash out a tone for the skin of the grade here adjacent, so that the Tempietto rests on sort of terra firma here. So again, we step from the threshold of this arch. We're going to come through and make that a little bit darker. We're into a dark tone, then a brightness to take us up the stairs, and we'll work on darkness to take us around the columns and into the space directly behind it. So we can push up to number 5 now. And maybe we'll start with sort of the left side of this. We'll choose it as being a darker value than the right. So we'll add the 5 to this first. Again, don't carry it all the way through, just from here to that point. And then flip to the chisel side and make this edge stronger. And just wash that down for now. It's not really a decorative stone, it's more of a stucco finish, so it's just a monolithic tone most of the way. And now we'll pick up some of the detail in the back, which receives less light. And we'll use that to corner and edge the temple to make our way around it. And we'll bring that value into the courtyard architecture. Put it down in the shade. And we'll bring it right up to the edge of the Tempietto base against the brightness of the sun's hitting this left column, the far left column to it. And that way it pulls, it gives us a definition of space. So when you visually hit the skin of it, your eye is going around to the back. And so it's almost got this weird sense that when you're there, as you walk around it, and it's so identical on every different aspect to it, it's got this little bit of a spinning quality to it. And the purity of it and the way it's been maintained over the centuries now makes it again this great spectacle in Western architectural history. Let's wrap it on this side to pull that off the back. And now this is the side that gets direct light from the sun, so it will have a cast shadow from the top area there, and then a little bit at the base of the windows, just to detail it out. And now we're going to take this type of dark of 5 and assign value into our key areas that we'll take to 90% as we move along. Just the upper section of these now. So again, just like all the other sketches, we kind of repeat the sketch as time allows. So if you did want to do this in 30 or 40 minutes where we are now, you could say this is the 40-minute sketch and you are done for that amount of time. You're not caught having to commit 2 hours no matter what you do. You want to make sure that at any time when you pull up and finish, it's finished for that amount of time. So we'll use that dark to pull these columns off. So just adjacent to the dark side of it, we'll go even darker. The column we're working with. And then up to the top, we'll bring it to the underside. Move that along. We'll bring that 5 all the way down there and then all the way down here. Then we'll start to build up more of a three-dimensionality for those. And now we'll come inside that door frame. And we'll actually then articulate the door proper inside of its stone frame. And this will eventually go deeper and deeper and be one of our strongest blacks by the time the sketch is done. Now this back wall that isn't receiving light is also back in this direction. So as these lines come down, they hit this corner and then retreat back up. So right at this point, we see this back wall behind it. And then the light's hitting this very strongly. So right at that corner is a big change in value. And then bring 5 around on all of our curves and sweep that around. And up to the top too, we can now start to detail the dome as each section would be deeper and deeper in tone and value to one side. And now to number 6. Last time on 6 is we simply move our way around really quickly. Top section there, little section. Now you're doing darks within the darks. Some of the architectural detail in the drum. And kind of highlighting the edges, the lips of things. So the back side, excuse me, the underside of the entablature here. And then potentially the tops of the columns we drew on before. See a little bit from this corner coming down. Right on the edge there, there's a doorway or a portal, so that's a nice black against our light. Now starting from the strongest edge of the stair, that's in the darkest area. This side coming back over here. And the windows we had started before. And obviously when you're doing columns that are in the foreground, you always do them a little bit fatter as you move your media towards it, because if you do it thinner, you really can't go back and pull the media off. If you make them too broad, you can keep scaling them back by hitting the edges and making them appropriate to the scale that's indicated. And now to number 7, a little bit less as we make our way in the next couple of minutes to 9 and sign off on it. Again, less within each area. Now we're starting to really vary what we're doing here in terms of where we want our final blacks to show up at. This is the actual lip of the metal driving the water off the edge. Now coming around the back side, check all of your little fish hooks to make sure they're really spinning around. Right to that edge. It's a clean line to edge all these columns out. We have a little lip. Yeah, shadow. I think I'll drop back to 5 for this. Because when you come to the last step, there actually are 3 more treads that rise up in the center, and there's a little bit of a half wall. So these step out in angular direction. And this half wall wraps around almost right on the horizon line, so it's flat, but it does have a little bit of a projection of a shadow cast at the base of the columns, and then we see no light on this end. It's important to move that around. And now can we pull this off the white background over here? I would take that 5 and deepen the ones on this edge of the columns wrapping around and keep a little more of a sparkle or brilliance, the one that's closest to us, and then certainly the one that's over on this side, which receives the most light, even though it's not central to our sketch there. Okay, and then back to 7. Finish up a couple more strokes of pattern. And if you do these more in blocks, down here where it is the cut stone, and you vary that a little bit, it'll give the quality of being pieces and sections of architecture. It does this, breaking down the scale a little bit. And now to 80%. So your 70s, 80s, and 90s will last a long time. Your 2 through 5, you may need to replace more often, just because of the time on the paper compared to the others. So we can come back into some of the dark areas behind these in the distance. So we sort of show that depth of the roof penetrating behind that, and this sort of spinning in space. So we're choosing our final areas of black and going to push through with the 80 and 90 here. And then finally 90. And then once we get this done, we assign our final blacks. We'll go back in with a 2 and 3 and kind of wash some of the tones together. So in the least amount of places, probably right on axis here to bring us back to that central point. That line's key. It's been around there. Edge against the backdrop. So maybe go back to 3 first. The last closing seconds here. And kind of wash out It's an elliptical cast movement in the shadow, leaving some light still there. Really burn it toward the right side. We'll do the same over here. Dark's coming through. So the alcohol is just doing a little bit of blending of the colors that were there. So you can get away some of your strokes. Pulling off the sky in the backdrop. And that whole hot spot of sun striking on there. And there we have from 1502 to 1506. Rotate around to our front piece here. Oh, where is that? Monte's Tempietto. Great reflects Brunelleschi's style, the perfectly proportioned ideas that are written about in the Renaissance as the Italianate states rediscovered their historic past from centuries ago.